Hello and welcome to the Armin Show podcast. Science, creativity, people learning more. We like to learn, connecting with people across the planet and what they are doing. If we don't figure out things, what are we doing out here in our short time? Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, whatever it might be, wherever, Spotify, YouTube. On this episode here, we have two guests, which is the favorite on here. We like panels. We like multiple people, collaboration in some form. This is what I've been a fan of for over 10, 20, 30 years, my whole existence. And the two authors, co-collaborators, if you will, of this book, Citizens. I'm doing better at showcasing things, right? It is called Citizens. It is Jon Alexander and Ariane Conrad. We all have a copy of the book. Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us. Both of you, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I'm glad to have you both on. I am coming from Los Angeles. Jon is in London, and Ariane is in Berlin. So global in a way. Colorful cover, great concept. I've always talked about creation over consumption for a long time. I've made content across blogs and every single social media that showed up. Even if it wasn't successful, I had a theme underneath all my content, which was I just make things I'm trying to express. I'm not on the scrolling side, I'm on the creation side, which is like it puts the power in your hands. That's one thing I related with here. And I relate with both of you because Jon has a lot of passion for the message here of being a citizen versus a subject, someone that is compelled by the outside force repeatedly, like reacting. And Ariane, as a supporter of this, I've always been a builder of certain people. I've also put people together in relationships sometimes. Ariane does this in the book category. She is the book doula. First, I will go to Ariane, actually, in relation to that. How did you meet Jon, and what is a book doula?
Wow, starting with me. Thank you. A doula, you might know, is a person, like a midwife, right, who delivers babies. And when I finished the first book that I ever helped bring into the world, it had taken just about 9.5 months. And it felt kind of, even though I've never gone through the baby bearing journey, it felt like there was a parallel there. So the book doula brings books into the world in that same way. I support authors intellectually and emotionally. Doing a book is a intimidating process, and lots of people need, holding and encouraging and cheerleading, as well as just the technical editing and making the sentences sound good and things like that. And I met Jon 2016 at a gathering. It was like a global gathering for, at the time, the very up-and-coming collaborative economy space, also called the sharing economy space, which, as we talk about in the book a little bit, ultimately devolved and kind of went the way of business as usual when Airbnb and Uber kind of took over the game. But in the beginning, it was a really hopeful, beautiful space full of very creative, collaborative people who thought that we might lessen our consumption, create relationships through this new economic set of models, so good for the planet, good for people. That didn't quite happen, but I met Jon, so win.
That's cool stuff. We have these brief moments where we meet somebody and it's like, how did that happen? But afterwards, it's like, good thing that happened, and that's like a big fork in the road in a way. Wonderful feature. Jon, you were the person on the other end of that meeting. Tell me about that, and also what got you into, why would you go to such an event? Is the goal to meet people? What's the idea?
Great question. Back in 2016, I guess I've been working with the ideas that have come to sort of be pulled together in the book for a couple of years by that point. But in some ways at that stage, I was wondering if the world was sort of fixing itself, or rather that technology was going to fix it for us, that technology would save us, and this phenomenon of the sharing economy looked like it was going to do that. As Ariane says, these apps that promise to sort of enable every transaction to become a relationship instead, and that was really the excitement of WeShare. And so I went to the gathering was called the WeShare Fest in Paris, in France, and I went along to that. I guess with the ideas that I was working with, as I say, taking shape, but also wanting to learn and experience what the promise of this new wave of technology was, and also to meet people. I mean, the vibe of it just came across as really fun. It was in a big circus tent by the Canal Saint-Martin in Paris. It was like, yeah, that's going to be a nice couple of days. And then very early in the conference, Ariane was one of the I think you were helping to organise or hosting some of the event, and she was stood there on stage in this amazing red dress, looking like the power of the whole conference. This was the being that would save us all. And so I did the naughty thing going, who the hell is this lady? And looked her up, and found the book dealer and was like, okay, hang on, this is what I might need to figure out if these ideas are actually worth putting out into the world in some shape or not. This might be the missing ingredient.
On the internet in 2022, she would be the main character. That's what it's referred to as. And so she was the main character up there, and you notice that this actually matches the theme here, but that's a good point. Should we all feel like we are the main character in life, Ariane?
Well, that's a funny thing that you asked that question, Armin, because we have been talking about the story of the hero quite a bit, Jon and I recently, and I feel like heroism, came up during the pandemic with we were calling essential workers sort of, heroes, and they are heroes, but we weren't really treating them as heroes. So we were sort of weaponizing heroism to make them put their lives on the line, right? Very unfair sort of twist in the heroic story. And we've been talking a lot about how heroism and this idea of kind of the lone hero fixing everything and charging in and having the silver bullet solution is an idea that comes out of clearly and has really thrived during what Jon calls the consumer story. And it's actually, I think, a story that's over. So even though I appreciate being called the main character, I think I'm certainly somebody who I enjoy staying in the background in a more supportive role. For me, also, there's a whole aspect to that, which is about race and realizing the role of white people over history, and that there's a need for those of us who benefit from white privilege to sort of step back. So that's definitely the way I work with people. And I would say, in talking about what the citizen is and the way that the citizen era functions, which Jon can talk much more about, it's not so much about the lone hero and the sole hero and the main character. It's about really all of us being smarter than any of us.
There's a collaborative effort. It's like a cooperation of sorts that's related to Nicola Rehani and her book about cooperation and the concepts you had shared there. I had spoken with her before, and I was like, okay, from fish we can now take much more than we would have thought just from looking at fish. They have dealings and such and working with each other that we can adapt in some way. Jon, what is it about collaboration and cooperation you'd like to see more of? What does Citizens represent? Why is this book here?
Why is this book here? Why do you exist? we've had the nice warm small talk introductions. It's wonderful that you mentioned Nicola's book. Nicola and I know one another a bit, and I've drawn on her work over the last 10 years really as a counterpoint and as a sort of construction point for my own. I think this idea that I particularly love those of you who haven't listened to Armin's episode with Nicola or read her book. She wrote a book called The Social Instinct, and she comes from a background in evolutionary biology and evolutionary behaviour. And I think I love the title of that because of the counterpoint of it to the title of Richard Dawkins' famous book, The Selfish Gene. And I think that the way of it, what she's doing with that work and expressing, like just because, yes, genes may be selfish in the sense that genes want, that if genes can be said to have a desire, it's to pass themselves on and perpetuate. But actually, that one of the strongest survival strategies through every species on the planet is cooperation. And I think a big part of what we're doing with this book is saying, look, actually, this is the deep story of humanity. Like, the deepest story of humanity, the deepest truth of us, is that we are by nature collaborative, caring, creative creatures. This is who we are and what we want to do in the world, and goes way back into our history, before writing and kings and all of this sort of stuff. And actually, now is a moment in time when we have an opportunity and perhaps a necessity. Probably go so far as to say a necessity to actually step into that deeper story of ourselves. So the book really is a diagnosis of the moment in time we're living in, and an attempt to offer a possible future. It's a way of what we're saying. I think is we're living in a moment when the stories we tell ourselves, or we have been telling ourselves certainly for the last 80 years, arguably for the last 12,000 years, have reached the end of their useful life. The idea of people as subjects, as people who have stuff done to them, as people who should keep their heads down and do as they're told, because the God-given few will lead us to a better society that arguably dominated for thousands of years, certainly the last few hundred, until the two world wars, is certainly way past its sell-by date. But because its bargain is protection in return for obedience, and its offer is of safety in times of chaos, it's having a resurgence. And then the second story that we talk about, the consumer story, this is the story that's dominated since the two world wars, when the subject story collapsed due to the rise of the middle class, the Industrial Revolution. The consumer story took over and was more or less deliberately constructed. And the consumer story said, look out for number one, get the best deal for yourself. And if everyone pursues self-interest, individual self-interest, that will add up to collective interest. That will result in the best outcomes for society as a whole. And that story is now collapsing in on itself, because it simply can't hold in a world where we're beset by ecological crisis. A story that says that the right thing to do is to look out for yourself as an individual simply can't hold, because we need cooperation and collaboration. In a society where we're beset by an epidemic of loneliness and poor mental health, we're stuck in a story that says that we're individuals who should stand alone, and that simply can't hold. We need caring and connection. And so this idea is really saying, what if we see this moment not just as how do we fix the world from where we are? Who are our heroes going to be, as you've so beautifully drawn out of Ariane? But actually, how do we reclaim a bigger and deeper idea of ourselves and all be part of figuring out what it is we need to do from here?
You mentioned an important point here that relates multiple themes connecting with Ariane here. Story is compelling. She helps build stories, and I noticed a theme from her that it's for her behind the scenes, like a force underneath that pushes something, which is kind of what a story does in society. It's not the directly communicated thing. It's the story. It's the message underneath that everybody is acting upon, but maybe not so aware of. When it comes to that idea, Ariane, how important is it that the story is reframed? Can it be reframed? And should it be like that, where it's a base for society, and then people just kind of, it's like riding on the wave of that story?
Well, I'm gonna loop Jon in here in a moment, because they are actually, I think, I have become, through collaborating with Jon, more of an expert on the kind of story he's talking about in Citizens, which is the way some people talk about worldview or paradigm or, well, let's just leave both of those words there. Narrative is the last one I was thinking about. And there are, people really looking at narrative change. And I would say that although I'm working on books, and you would think that books are about narrative change, the kind of, first of all, and, one title for this book, actually, the working title for a long time was The Citizen Revelation. Not Citizens, but The Citizen Revelation, which our fine editor, decided was just too many syllables. But because one of the things that's really exciting about Jon's work, when he described it to me as we were developing the book, is that there's this moment when people see the current story that we are currently trapped inside of, right? Which is the citizen story is the dominant story that we're trapped inside of. And when Jon and his team at the New Citizenship Project work with people and get them alone to see the story, right? It's like the Matrix moment, right? Which is like you can't see it. It's like it's like the water, the water that you're swimming in, as Nicola's fish. And so that piece of work, just seeing it, is a huge part of the change. And then there's like having really seen it, holding a news story, which is a whole process of itself to sort of develop and then live into and step into the new story, which Jon is much better at talking about. So I'm handing it over to him.
No, I think it's actually really interesting because we had this was one of the dynamics of our relationship in writing the book was actually sort of almost contesting some of the ways to describe these concepts a bit between ourselves, because I came in pretty convinced by the idea of talking about these things as stories and talking about a shift from subject to consumer to citizen, and Ariane, I think, really challenged that and was like, if you're going to talk about that, you've got to be really clear on what kind of story this is. And I think that the discipline of that challenge is what took us into these ideas about paradigm shift, and the work of Donella Meadows in particular on systems thinking and the role of paradigms as what she calls the sources of systems. And we're also into the work of the Berkeley sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild, who in her book which is very relevant to the US audience for this, she wrote a book called Strangers in Their Own Land. After having worked in countries all over the world as a sociologist, she went and embedded herself in Louisiana in the Deep South in 2014 and 2015, and came out with this, because she felt that her own country people had become alien to her, and came out with this conception of what she started to call a deep story, a story that people appeal to understand their situation and use to construct their ideas of what's right and wrong, to this idea of like humans as inherently collaborative, creative, caring creatures. It's to the stories that they live in, it's to the deep stories that we live in, that we appeal in order to understand who to care for, who to collaborate with, what to create. And Hochschild and Donella Meadows, I think, were probably and then also many other influences. Thomas Berry, the Catholic theologian and thinker, Bayo Konolafe, the contemporary Nigerian philosopher. We drew on a lot of these things through really kind of arguing out between us whether story was the right kind of concept to play with. And I think we ended up we tried various things, and ended up back with it, but much more kind of solidly standing it and understanding what it was we meant. And I think that discipline of really going, no, this is a particular kind of story that, as you say, Armin, sort of sits underneath, that pushes itself through into our lives in so many different ways without us really knowing it, I think is a major kind of gift of the book, as an offer to people to be able to see those dynamics in action. So yeah, stories matter very deeply, but I think we can we can say that too lightly and not really understand what we mean when we're saying it.
One thing that comes to mind there is behind a story is usually could be a writer, but we'll call it a producer in this case. I recently saw a talk where an artist was saying how artists are known, but then the producer behind the scenes is usually not known, and they might be a reason why an album was formulated a certain way, and if not for them, these 8 songs would not be there, or they wouldn't have collaborated with that person. But you can't really point to that because all you see at the end is the result after the fact. Ariane, do you think of are there any producers that have created the stories we ascribe to behind the scenes that have been difficult to point to in the past? Does anything come to mind in that category?
Well, another very incisive question. Jon and I, one of my provocations to Jon when we had these very conversations that he was just talking about, was like, who's the bad guy here? Like, people like inherent, as you just said, in the concept of a story is who's telling the story, who is like, do we have somebody to pin these stories on? And we went around and around around that. And these kinds of stories, they may have some figures who champion them for their own self-interest at the beginning. So in terms of the consumer story, for example, we highlight the work of Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who really created the PR industry, right? And viewed everything through that lens of sort of manipulating human behavior. And so certainly there were key individuals who helped architect the stories that we're living in, but stories have a life of their own at a certain point, and they keep on, snowballing, and they're self-reinforcing. And the more that they then take hold, and the more people are believing in them. Like, one of the things that I think is fascinating with Jon's opportunity right now to talk about the book is just watching him take things that are happening, right, current events, and see them through the lens of subject, consumer, citizen, and see them through the lens of the story. And I'm constantly struck now, having worked on this with him, by I'll sort of say to myself, that's the consumer tainting this. That's the consumer tainting this as well. I can see that now. But in any case, I feel like there are many hands, involved in the mix, and ultimately, at a certain point, we're also implicit. We're also collaborating, with upholding the stories. We can't, especially when we can't see the stories for what they are. We have a tendency to continue their life.
I think that's right. I think we're living in this time. It's so easy to. It's one of the things about stories is it's very difficult to construct them without heroes as well. And one of the decisions we made in the opening of the book was to hero. Ironically, because the closing of the book is about the anti-hero, we sort of made this decision to hero 5 emblematic citizens and tell their kind of individual stories. But at the same time, the people we chose were quite deliberately sort of fairly very relatable characters, and I think a big part of what we're trying to do with that is say, not just that we need a different kind of hero in this moment in time, which is part of it, because the sort of founding stories of the heroes of the consumer era all made us feel like they were exceptional humans and we were nothing like them. Whereas I think the stories of the heroes of the citizen era are the stories of every man and every woman, every person. And I think that within that then lies the point that actually the citizen era will only come into existence fully when we all feel not just like the heroes of our own stories, which is sort of the consumer era vibe, able to act and encouraged to act, but also like it's incumbent upon us to encourage others to act as well. Like the true sort of role of a champion in this time is to open the door and pass the mic and bring others in, not to ride to the rescue. And I think that's kind of a critical point about like what we need to be and do in this time. It's not about identifying the right solution and providing it. It's about creating the space for everyone to step into their own agency. I really love, to cite another author, I'm in danger of like recommending lots of other people's books rather than my own in this conversation. But and by the way, read all of Ariane's other books rather than mine as well. But there's one that I really love, a guy called Cormac Russell, who's an Irish democracy thinker and practitioner, like grassroots democracy thinker and practitioner, has this lovely metaphor. He talks about helping while walking backwards as opposed to helping while walking forwards. And what he means is like if you help by walking forwards, you're sort of pushing your agency into that space. Whereas if you help by walking backwards, you're increasing the space for the person in question throughout, and your destination in helping while walking backwards is you being removed from the scene. And I think I find that a really important thing to put into place. And just on the Ariane sort of through the hook of the like seeing the subject, consumer and citizen stories in the moments we're living in. I've been really struck recently, like as we all have, like staring at the tragedies and the triumphs as well of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, and seeing the subject story so clearly embodied by Putin and the leadership story he's trying to sell, and to some extent, like I worry for us as the West, because I see the consumer story still too present in the way in Biden's speech in Warsaw, in the way the German Chancellor is trying to sort of is defining his duty to his people. And then I see Zelensky leading in this sort of deeply citizen fashion, appealing to the people of Ukraine, but also to the people of Russia and to the people of the world, and giving us all agency in this. And I think that it becomes very. I think this is the power of it, like being able to see those things and hold them as counterpoints, and be able to recognise the dynamics that are going on there, and know that we have some degree of choice in that as well. I think that's what I would hope the gift of the book might be.
Agency is a big deal. I've looked at this my whole existence. It makes me think of the story I've told myself. I've always had good self-esteem, and I've seen other people who didn't have that, and then it limited them forever. And then every other thing they did was on top of this base of lower self-esteem. You could just see that story is a big deal there. If it comes to mind, take us through one story that you cover here and where in the world it is involved that happened.
You're going to do Taiwan? You're going to do Taiwan, right?
I mean, like the story of the Taiwanese government over the last decade is completely. It's the story in the book that made me go, this is real and happening, and could actually take hold as the story of our society. And it starts back in 2012. The government at that time was essentially trying to sort of hold power and centralise power under the guise of the consumer story, and that they set up what they called the economic power up plan, and they produced television commercials which this almost word-for-word quote said things like, let's not waste time talking about policies and complicated things like that. Let's instead we'll concentrate on growing the economy, and you get on with your lives, which is sort of shush little people, just go shopping in the language of the book. And the response to this initially was a hacker movement started to form, and they called themselves GovZero. And what they did initially was they built parallel websites to government websites with the URLs g0v.tw, hence GovZero. And what these websites allowed was for people to engage and experience the possibility of engagement and agency in relation to government in a whole different way, being able to comment on and upvote and downvote and sort of understand the data in relation to government, rather than being told, rather than the message being shush, just go shopping. and people, and the audience for this grew, and then 2014 came, and the government tried to rush through a trade deal with mainland China under the sort of banner of the Economic Power Up plan. And students who'd been using, many of whom had been using these GovZero websites, occupied the parliament. And the GovZero team got a broadband connection and started streaming what the students were doing in the parliament across the country through social media and then broadcast media. And what they were doing was debating the clauses of the trade bill. And people began to see this, and the conversation grew. And then pressure came on the Speaker of the Parliament to boot the protesters out. And everyone thought he would. It's the most obvious thing to do. He was a member of the governing party by political affiliation. But he didn't. He said, this is what democracy looks like. It's a space where the people are exerting agency, the people are expressing agency, and scrutinising a trade bill that will shape all of their lives. And that's what this space should be used for. And in that moment, really, the whole story flipped, because the story moved from one where the government has agency over some things and we just have agency over our individual lives, to one where we all have agency together to shape the society we want to be part of. They all have agency together. We in the UK probably don't right now. But that, after that moment, things have not been the same since. So within 6 months, there were the students left the parliament. The speaker committed that the trade bill would get due scrutiny, and then it got rejected. Within 6 months, there were municipal elections, and candidates from across the country who'd stood by the protesters were elected, often from nowhere in the standings. After that, one of the leaders of the hacker movement was invited to become a mentor to a government minister. 2 years on, in 2016, there were presidential elections, and that person, Audrey Tang, who features heavily in the book, was made a minister in her own right. And then a lot of that group were in charge of the country's COVID response, which has been, again, rooted in this idea of actually, and I guess maybe the central idea of the book in this notion of like tapping into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. If you start from the belief that people are collaborative, caring, creative, capable creatures, then the role of a government or an organisation of any sort is to tap into the capabilities and the creativity of those people, and that's how they battled. That's how they've taken on COVID. Even now, as they try and shift to living with, in some ways, they're still doing the same thing. And I mean, my favourite story from that first phase of COVID was they set up a phone line where any citizen could ring in with an idea for how the country's response could be better. And a 6-year-old boy rang up and said. The boys in my class don't want to wear their face masks because they're pink and they think they're girly, so you need to do something to make pink face masks cool. And I think you should work with the baseball team. And 3 days later, then, half the time in his baseball team, the president and the little boy all on the national press conference, resplendent in their pink face masks. And it's just this idea of like, I think we live in a moment when we can. You're picking up on this idea of agency, Armin, which I think is absolutely central. We're in danger of being in a cycle where our leaders put too little trust in us and give us too little agency. We kick back by seeking agency where we have it, and when the only expression of our agency is a referendum or a one in X year's vote, then we use that to fight rather than to build. And in response to that, our leaders trust us less again. And so we risk being in a kind of vicious circle in this way, where people are then leaders and would-be leaders are then tempted to occupy that space by turning us against one another and dividing us, when actually there's a huge opportunity just to look at this a whole other way and go, if we put our trust in people, if we give people agency, if we put more power in more people's hands, more and more diverse people's hands, then actually that's the way we'll build the better society. I think it's sort of the frustration of this work is that in some ways, once you see it, it's so obvious. But until you see it, it feels so distant from where we are right now.
On this topic of agency, What comes to mind, Ariane, as a way that the average person can increase their self-agency? Are they out of luck if they haven't had that experience in their life up until now? Can they become more like the people who take things more into their own hands? What's your view on that?
Wow, I feel a little out of my depth there. I feel like we need a psychologist Ariana or a sociologist Ariana or something to talk.
I think one of the things we talked about in the book that you brought huge amounts into was the ideas of home and kind of finding belonging, which I think is a huge part of this. Maybe you could say some of the inspirations you brought.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's true. I mean, so one of the things that we talk about is the very first thing that one needs to do is identify the realm in which you about which you're passionate and where you have some power. Some of us have less power than others, particularly in certain spaces. So that may be your neighborhood, but it may also not be your neighborhood. It may be maybe a field in which you see that something needs to change. It may be, it may be your workplace, but again, you may not have power in your workplace. So finding this sort of space, and this is a little bit different than home and belonging, which have more to do with where you have the passion and you feel the motivation and you feel a sense of connection. We quoted some beautiful work. One of my favorite authors is a man named Jenkinson. He wrote a book called Die Wise, which is a true favorite of mine. And part of his work is with people at the end of their lives. And just seeing how in Western cultures, people at the ends of their lives are often in such a lost space, and particularly white folks and white folks who have descended from colonizers who are therefore far from their roots, right? Colonizer settlers are far from their roots. He contrasts this to what he knows from having worked with his Canadian, this writer, Jenkinson, what he knows from having worked with Indigenous people, Indigenous Canadians, where there is this, that is what it is to be Indigenous, is to, feel you belong to the land and have this relationship with your land. And so Jenkinson talks about it's a very active process. This process of connecting and really building a relationship to home is something that we don't think about. And I loved, John, in your conversation with Baratunde Thurston, the conversation about real estate and housing and homes and how we have this tendency to put that's another tainting from the consumer story, right? Is that the fact that a lot of people buy real estate, which is already this weird word that kind of like removes you from the sense of home, and thinks about like speculation and investment as opposed to rooting and belonging and grounding. And then we also, so that's Stephen Jenkinson's work, his orphan wisdom work. He calls descendants of settler colonizers orphans because we have lost really that connection. And then we also talk about Brene Brown's work, who I'm sure all of your listeners are familiar with her work. And she wrote that one book on belonging, the name of which is escaping me right now, in which she also talks about belonging as this really active choice. So in terms of, I guess, like that's a great way to answer this question. Not being a psychologist, in terms of like how to build agency, I think is really that work of belonging. In Brene Brown's language, she talks about, sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that belonging is like this passive thing, that we actually mute our individuality in order to belong, right? To belong to like, a group, you become less yourself. And she's like, it's the exact opposite. The true way of belonging is being, the most of yourself, being brave, exactly, like stepping forward, being fully yourself, and then allowing that to connect you to the places and the people where you really belong.
One follow-up to that actually is, as you mentioned, working with where you have power or taking with what is applicable. I was talking about this a couple of days ago. You can't really work with the things that aren't there or aren't skills. There's nothing to do there. But the things that are there or built-in abilities, do bring that in the book world where you see, okay, this writer has these 4 positive qualities. I will help enunciate them versus like if there's something's missing, there's only so much you can do with that, right? Like how are you going to propel that forward? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm definitely a strengths-based person. So yeah, like, I mean, my work is always different. And it's all about where that person's confidence areas are and figuring out how we're going to work with those. And yeah, arrange them to make the most impact, essentially, leverage them. It makes me think, though, of the other thing that I'm really fond of in that early section of the book, which is about experts versus amateurs, and how one of the things that's very citizen is that in the past we've had these people in charge of everything, and they all kind of have the same education. Like a lot of them literally have the same degrees at the same schools, right? The people in Parliament in the UK and Congress in the US, right? Like also other kinds of decision makers in other realms. And one of the things in the citizen story is that like the amateur is welcome. And in fact, the amateur, somebody from outside the field might be able to see things that people, with that same training, who took that same path, who have that same lived experience would never see, right? And so when we open things up to amateur involvement, we get this rich abundance of new ideas and new paths.
I was also talking about that like 2-3 weeks ago about how, let's say there's an office and people have been working there for 30 years and they're like, somebody comes up that's new and they've been there for a month and they bring up some changes that nobody's done in 20 years. And then this person was saying, oh, isn't that shocking? And I said, no, it's not shocking because the person who's been there for 30 years, they probably have all these relationships and limitations where they're not going to say anything. I don't want to mess up what's going on. Whereas the person that just showed up is like, one, they see it very clearly because we have our reticular activation system that notices differences that have happened. So it's like, oh, that's not good. That's not functional. And they also don't have all these ties that they're like locked into, that if they say this, then John's going to be annoyed and Melissa is going to have some sort of plan. So I always think about it that way. They would be more likely. So when you bring in, it's like a multidisciplinary sense, suddenly you get way more growth in a short period than you could have ever gotten. You might have left that company for 50 more years, and if you didn't bring in anything, it would have remained the same because there's no compelling force to change it. On that one, John, where does the compelling force to change things come from? Is it like the human condition that any new individual in a group or varied others will come and bring the change? Is that the only way?
You ask some really rich questions, Armin. You're like, where are we going next? It's like, where does the compelling force for change come from? I think I'm really fond. As I say, we did a lot of work around the concepts of story, and when we came back to these ideas of story as paradigm. And I went back into the work of Thomas Kuhn, the sort of work on the structure of scientific revolutions, that sort of famous book. And I came across this bit in it where he talks about, essentially, and we paraphrased it in the book, was the point, one of the key points he makes is you can't have paradigm shift without paradigm to shift to. And I think that sort of idea that the compelling force for change cannot just be a rejection or a failure of the existing. It's not enough. The compelling force for change, it also has to be the availability of a new, a different. And I think that the Taiwanese example speaks very powerfully to it. Like very literally with the creation of Gov Zero. It also reminds me of the Buckminster Fuller quote. The one of like you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change things, create a new reality that makes the old one obsolete. And I think like what I loved about the process of writing the book, and ultimately, like that's the point of writing the book, is to say, like, we need to be able to see that things could be different, that there is another coherent option. Because otherwise, if the only coherent options we can see are the consumer story and kind of a world where Elon Musk owns the global reserve currency, which is sort of feels like is the next stage of the consumer story, if the only alternative to that is a state surveillance China, then when we sort of go to the Musk world, or maybe some go to the China world because they reject the Musk world, but where those two feel like they are only options, there is a compelling force for change that comes from rejection, but the only option available is a retrograde step. And so the compelling force for change has to come from the availability of a new as well. And I think that one of the big things for me in the book and in the dynamic between Ariane and myself was I think. And she's spoken to it a little bit and hinted at it in what she was saying about belonging just now. But like that story, when it's only constructed from a view from within, from someone who looks and sounds like me, is incomplete. And I think a big part of the process of the book was Ariane. So I had some of the kind of core frames, the subject, consumer, and citizen were there, as it were, as language, and I had some sense of it and was talking about some of these shifts and had been working with the ideas for several years. But it was only when we started working together that Ariane was challenging me to go, like, you've got to see the richness from the outside of this. You've got to see that it's not just the people, the marginalised folks who need to be offered power, need their power increased to be able to create the story. It's also that the white folks like you, the white guys, the straight white guys, have an awful lot to learn to be able to liberate themselves from their own limitations of belief, from their orphanness. And I think so. I guess the reason why I'm going there is just to go. I think the compelling force for change has to be a sight of the new, and a coherent, a reasonably coherent. It doesn't have to be fixed and finished, but it needs to be coherent enough to feel safe to step into. And then it also requires the humility on the part of those who will be in the positions of power to be able to say, we've got a lot to learn, because there can be a restraining factor. The thing that if the compelling force for change has to come from an articulation of the new, the deepest barrier that has to be removed is the ego of those who would otherwise try and save us. And I think I also just to be really clear what I'm saying, I almost think I do think actually that the rise of authoritarianism is actually a lot less dangerous than the hero complex that rise of authoritarianism cues in those who position themselves as defenders of the status quo. Because I think the deeper risk is that we will believe that we need to defend what we have, because that is precise that defence, rather than the humility and the willingness to explore and step into the new, is ultimately the thing that will drive us into the arms of the old story.
I had this visual I gave to somebody recently about how in relationships, when there is one of the individuals, let's say a guy in this example, who's grabbing, I must hold on to this person and keep them from everything, and what you destroy it in the process. Putting things in a box, in a way, kills the thing in the box, and that wasn't. Why would you even want the thing in the box at that point? You've messed it up. So it's like a canceling force, right? You can't breathe anymore. You put a rabbit in there, something that's not what we're meant for. And so same thing with concept. If you do that, you kill the concept, and anybody coming around, that energy passes on to them, they should do it too. It's a limiting force. Versus the other one is I have my being, I have my representation, and if you want to, let's say you wanted to counter the book, write your own thoughts, put your own message out there, versus just saying this is no good, because that's like a pull back to nothing, which is what kind of goal is that? Always pulling back to the nothing versus rising up. Maybe the person needs to help pull them up, but still, this is cooler than dropping back to that force. I like that concept right there. On this one, I would like to say, Ariane, what would you say is a broader theme of your book support that you have done? And is there any messages you are trying to express through your position as a supportive figure for writers?
Well, I am a fan of working with very brave people. I think I could categorize the folks that I've collaborated with that way. I've forgotten the second part of your question. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, is there a theme that you're trying to present in your authorship? You're working with brave people. Is there any things you're
it's I'm you know.
I love watching her think about these questions because I can see the faces of all of her authors flitting past her eyes, and I know her kind of her unwillingness, her rejection of sort of generalising us, because she loves each and all of us so much. It's funny. I can see all of those things in her eyes. I'm buying you some time, but I think one of the reasons I was drawn to Ariane's Fold, I think, was because I think so many of the stories, and I'm really honoured that she was up for working with me, because a lot of I'm pretty rare in her fold as a white man, basically. She tends to draw out the stories of people of colour, of women, particularly of women, of those who've been marginalised in some way, and be someone who gives them amazing power. And it's one of the reasons. I mean, Ariane, I'm sure you'll be reflecting and want to speak for yourself far more now. But one of the ways I would reflect on one of the reasons I really wanted to make sure Ariane was on the cover of this book was because of that. Like, I think I am a different kind of character and in a different position to some of those. There she is, right there, on that cover. Thanks, Alan. But it's I think I would say the reason I was so drawn to her work is the sort of theme of exploring power. I think that's. I don't think I consciously knew that's what I was trying to do when I started out, and I'm not even sure. I'd love to know your reflection on whether you think that's something you're trying to do. But it's certain. There was something, and I think that I was unconsciously drawn to, and I think the more we've worked together, the more I think that is what it is. I think power is so central in this moment in time.
It's definitely a theme. It's very helpful to have you answer that question. Actually, more of what I was struggling with was sounding pompous. Like, I've worked with the people who are shaping history. Like. But I have been incredibly blessed to work with super. They're brave. They are. Everybody has brought such a huge heart to what they're doing, whether they're looking at human rights or the rights of the planet and the state of the planet, or labor policies, or new economic systems, and so, I think for sure. I mean, I have become somebody who reflects a lot on power dynamics, like crossed over with race and class and gender and sort of all the other intersectional points that exist. And it's what I am sought out for which I just walk around in this bubble of gratitude for the work that I get to do and the people that I get to work with. So I think that's spot on that, Jon, you mentioned that and called that out. It obviously also just makes me blushy and uncomfortable and inarticulate to talk about this stuff. So
this is why I'm the one who's going around going, buy my book, because Ariane would not quite be in that vibe.
No, I say
There's
that.
a nice
I say buy the book. Buy Jon's book. Buy Jon's.
You say buy my book. Well, you wouldn't say buy my book. With the me or you.
Yeah.
There's a nice careful consideration there. You can see it. It's like consideration for others and not outplaying or overplaying what they can bring to the table, which is without that, the other person may feel somewhat stepped on in some ways versus oh, okay, we're on the same stairs, same stair of the stairs and can discuss things and maybe I can figure something out. That's a very necessary quality. And if it's too much oomph brought in, that might go away. The person might be like, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. Versus if Ariane shows up, they might be like, today is the day I will voice something that comes to my mind. So it's like a welcoming feature. So that's necessary in that capacity. Now, one thing I would like to check with Jon is if you had a theme you would want people to take from the book, what would that theme be for their day, for their days as they go forward?
I think to this thing about power, I think a big central theme of this book is the idea and the acknowledgement that the push to acknowledge the power that we all have and that we all express every day, and that isn't just about the power we have as individuals, the 5 things you can do, the behaviour changes you can make. It's almost explicitly not about that kind of power. It's the power that we have as potential and actual members of collectives and collaborations. And I think the question I end the book on, we ended the book on, but one of the few really good things that was directly from me, and all Ariane had to do was say, "That's really good, let's do that." was the closing of the final section where we ended it on using Rebecca Solnit's definition of hope, and Solnit talks about the idea that hope can be understood as distinct from optimism, because optimism suggests that things will be all right no matter what we do, and hope requires an acknowledgement of uncertainty. It doesn't request the certainty of things being okay. It acknowledges and embraces the uncertainty that things might or might not be okay, and sees in that uncertainty, as she calls it, the space for action. And then we'll finish. The very last words of the book are the question that I do live by, I try and ask myself every day and think about every day, which is what would you do in this time if you truly believed not just in yourself but also in those around you, if you really looked around and when these people who are all around me, who I come into contact with, are capable of and want to be part of fixing everything, and my job is to try and unleash that. If you work from that basis, what would you do? And I do understand that's a question that is more challenging for some to hold than others. It's more challenging to stick to in particular economic circumstances. It's more, but also it's actually very, to this point about the liberation and the orphanness, it's also very challenging for people who seem to be in positions of privilege because they've been conditioned to believe that they should be the solution, not to see the solution in others. So I guess if there is a theme, if there is a kind of a message that I wouldn't want anyone want to miss. It's like people are amazing if you give them the chance to be, and if you can create the conditions for them to be. And so that's what we should try to do.
Ariane, I want to point out that I was just informed by John that people are amazing. You're a people, so you're also in the amazing category. Now, last thing I want to check is, where can people find your work, Ariane? Where might you direct them?
Well, you can see all of the books that I've worked on where I'm allowed to acknowledge it publicly on my website, arianeconrad.com. Then you can click through and check them all out and buy them. Lots of wonderful projects.
That's cool. And John, as well, where might people locate your content? Also about the new Citizenship Project as well.
So you can find me. I'm very active on LinkedIn and Twitter. You'll find me pretty easily. My website is jonalexander.net. You can buy the book everywhere in all good bookstores, I hope. Certainly on bookdepository.com if availability is poor anywhere else. That seems to be working. And the New Citizenship Project, my consulting business, is on newcitizenship.org.uk. And the last plug I will give in fitting spirit be, if there are any people listening to this, watching this, who think they might have a big idea booking that could shape the world. Ariane, my book was born really. It was born when we met at that We Share Festival in 2016, but it really took shape on a thing called the Storia Summit that Ariane hosts in October on the beautiful Spanish island of Mallorca. And I think there are a few spots still available if there are budding authors in the audience for this. So check out storiasummit.com as well.
Along with people who host things, write things, create things, the whole package. Jon, Ariane, I would like to thank you both for joining on this episode and sharing some insights from both Citizens and your own work.
Thanks so much. Awesome.
Thank you for having us.
Fabulous.
Wonderful. And we are out.